Many researchers in university and research institutes, they do experiments, they do research in the lab. But of course, the lab is not the same as the world, right? The lab is part of the world, but it's not the same as the world. So the world, if you think of how people use language, how they communicate, it often looks like this. So it's very rich. It's a very rich situation that you see here. There are all sorts of things going on. People are moving, people are talking. There are all sorts of objects in the environment. The environment itself is very rich. It's a very dynamic situation. People are constantly moving. They're moving their hands, they're moving their face, they're moving their body. Language in everyday life is very communicative, almost by definition. So we use language to communicate, right? We do this in 3D environments. There's not just spoken auditory information, but there's also visual information. As I said, people make gestures. There's perhaps visual information in a certain posture that they take on. Their facial expressions, they give some visual information to the person that listens to them. So communication in everyday life is really multimodal. We use different modalities. We use the visual modality and we use the auditory modality at the same time when we're communicating. So at the same time, we're using different channels to communicate: the face, the body, speech. So this is a very rich everyday situation. This is what language is, right? This is what we use language for in everyday life. But if you then think of the lab, that's kind of a different situation, right? Often in a psychology experiments, you may have participated in some experiments of those yourself. It mostly looks like this. So you're placed in front of a computer screen. It's very different from this everyday situation in which language is typically used. So those kind of experiments are typically quite static, right? You're just sitting there as a participant. You're doing often some very repetitive tasks with different trials that all very much look the same. Language is typically used in a non-communicative way. So you're sitting there by yourself, looking at a computer screen. You're not really communicating with someone. Even if you're talking into this microphone that you see here, typically you're talking to nobody. You're just sitting there by yourself. Stimuli are often in 2D, and often there's just one modality that's important in that very specific experiment. So the researcher may be only interested in speech or only interested in facial expressions, not in everything at the same time as in the real world. So there seems to be quite a big gap, a big difference between how language is studied in the lab and how language is studied, not how language is studied, but how language is used in the world, in everyday life, in real life situations. And more researchers actually are sort of starting to realize that perhaps this is not a good thing. So many theories that we have about the cognition, the cognitive processes that allow us to talk to each other, to communicate with each other, are based on experiments that we have been doing in the lab. And then the question, of course, is, if that's the situation in which we developed our theories, can we be completely sure that they generalize to these very rich and dynamic situations in everyday life? In the end, if we're building theories about the psychology of language, what happens in your mind, in your brain, when you're talking to someone, when you're listening to someone, we hope that those theories that we have generalize to everyday life, because in the end, that's what we're interested in finding out how this works in natural situations. If we only study this in the lab, perhaps our theories are sort of restricted. They may not tell us everything that there is to tell about the psychology of language as it sort of takes place in everyday rich and dynamic situations. More and more researchers are sort of starting to realize this. So here, a researcher, for instance, says extrapolation from findings obtained in restrained lab settings to real life may be much less obvious than we think. So we may have thought that, we may have taken for granted sort of that our theories will generalize to everyday situations, but perhaps this is not the case at all. Here, related to language comprehension, a theoretical view of language comprehension as situated in a rich context seems intuitively plausible and appealing. This is not what has shaped the theories. So those theories have been shaped by this very static, repetitive experimental research, not by doing research in very rich experimental situations. Yeah, and some researchers even say what we've been doing as researchers in psychology is very much passive spectator science. So in those experiments in the lab, typically those experimental participants, they're just passive spectators. They're just sitting there doing a boring task. Maybe after an hour or so, when it's done, they get some money or they get some student credits because they have participated. But they're basically just passive spectators in this task often. Whereas in everyday life, of course, when we're using language, we're not passive spectators, right? Most of the time, we're just communicating, we're active. It's a joint action. We're jointly sort of involved in this conversation. So maybe the theories that we have is sort of restricted, and we might need to find a method that sort of combines the experimental control that we need to carefully measure things like brain activity, and pair this with, measure those things, pair this with situations in the lab that are still very much similar to the everyday world, to the real life situations that we're interested in terms of their richness. Well, and of course, that's where virtual reality comes in, right? Because virtual reality allows us in the lab to create very rich situations that very much resemble everyday life. But we can still measure the things that we're interested in. We can still, in a very controlled way, measure, for instance, brain activity. That's very hard to do in the real world. So it's very hard to place some brain electrodes on participants' heads in the real world while they're walking around or while they are talking and moving, and this creates all sorts of practical problems. The nice thing about VR is you can create this very rich and dynamic environment in the lab, still allowing you to carefully measure some kind of data, some dependent variable that you're interested in.